Darts are a triangular fold of material stitched wide at one end and tapering to a point. Darts are used to give fullness, provide freedom for arm movement, to give elbow room, and to make transitions in size from one area to another. A double dart, usually found at the waistline, is diamond-shaped with long point at each end. Although darts are used extensively in garments, there are darts in lots of other projects too. Here's a diagram showing the various dart locations available for a simple bodice. As you can see, a dart can be placed virtually anywhere. Let's take a closer look at these dart locations and see what they look like on the pattern and on the garment. Here's a little bodice that has the standard waist darts in it. It's also got waist darts in the back for shaping in the back. And this is pretty typical. You'll see a lot of top patterns that put the bust darts down here at the standard waist. And you can see what they do is remove fabric here so that it's more form-fitting. Here's a dart placed at the side area. This is referred to as a French dart. It comes up off the lower half of the bodice on the side, and it points into the bust area. This is a nice dart. It's not quite as obvious as a standard waist dart, and it can be contoured a little bit so it's not a straight line. This is also a good dart because it doesn't interfere with the grain of the fabric. You can imagine if our warp and weft grains were going up and down and side to side, this dart would cause little interference with that. So it would cause the fabric to drape a little bit nicer. Here we have a side dart. It's a dart that's placed off the side seam horizontally, pointing toward the bust. This is a nice dart. It's a little bit more subtle again. It's not something that's horribly obvious. But you'll notice as the dart starts moving up that we lose a little bit of our form here. It doesn't provide the shaping as much as the French dart or the standard waist dart would provide, but it still brings the bust area fullness in a little bit. So this is a nice dart that's often used on garments that aren't quite as conforming as one that might have full-blown waist darts on it. Here we have a center armhole dart, and you can see that we're losing even more form below the bust line, but it's still helping to fit the top nicely. This one is a little bit trickier because you would have the excess dart in here that you would need to deal with, at the sleeve. So it's probably a little bit more work, but it's a nice dart if you're looking for a different type of design option. And here is what it would look like on the pattern. And here we are with the shoulder point dart. It's coming right off the edge there of the shoulder up at the top. And this is nice because it does provide some shaping. Obviously we're losing pretty much all of our shaping down here, but it does help to conform a little bit more to the bust line. And this is a nice dart because it doesn't interfere with the grain as much. You're still going to have nice hang on your fabric, so you'll want to keep that in mind when you're deciding on your dart placement. And here, of course, is what it would look like on the pattern itself. Here we have a center shoulder dart, and this is very nice because it doesn't interfere with the grain lines. Also, it's providing yet another vertical line in the body, which is always good. It always thins you out if you can keep things vertical. And you've got virtually no shaping down here, but it does help form fit it up here. So these are interesting. You don't see these a lot, but it's certainly something you could incorporate yourself if you wanted to change up the design of your garment. Here we have a center neck position dart, and this is another one that's somewhat rare, but it does lend itself to keeping straight of grain on your fabric. It would square things up pretty nicely. Again, no shaping down below, but it's a nice vertical line that's being created with the dart, so that could be flattering, and if done properly this would look very nice. Here's a dart that you won't see very often. This is done at the center front neck. It's kind of a funky looking thing, but it's interesting. It certainly adds a lot to the really plain bodice here, and if you did this with the right fabric you could actually create somewhat of a design with the dart. So that's always an option. Working our way down that center front line, now we have one straight at the center front bust. And this is very unusual, but you'll see that now, since we're passing into the bust area, we are getting a little bit more shape on both sides of the bust dart, because we're pulling up at the bottom and down at the top. So we're getting a little bit more definition with this one. It's very different. It's not something that you see very often, and it's would be interesting to split it maybe into 3 darts at this position and create a little bit of a gathering effect. It would look really nice. And here is our last dart on the center front line, and this is the center front waist. You can see it creates a nice V down here, and it does a lot in the way of shaping below the bust line. It's an interesting design option and something that you might want to incorporate just to be a little bit different. Here we have a nice little gown that uses double darts, both in the front and the back, just to give it a little bit of shaping under the bust line to bring it in for the waist. And you can see that a double dart just looks like 2 singles with the bottoms attached. And when you sew these, you will always sew from this point to here and then go to the other end, this point to here. So you want to come in from both ends as you sew them. But this makes a nice form on a longer garment that has a length below the waistline, where you need to take up for the bust and you also need to take up for the waistline. Now that you've seen all the different places that you can place your darts on the bodice, you're probably wondering, how would you go about doing this? This is a small scale representation of a sloper bodice that's been drafted, and here you can see that it's got the standard waistline dart location. Now if you wanted to move this dart, let's say up to the mid shoulder line, you can use a technique referred to as slash and spread, where you would just slash to the line and then rotate the pattern piece to the new dart location. And there are some other adjustments that you would have to make, but they're pretty minor, so it's actually that easy to change a dart location. And you can split the difference, as I've done right here. I've got some of it up and some of it down, or you can just move the entire dart to a new location. So in this case we're going to take this one and move it to the center. Now, one thing that I need to make sure that you're aware of, this is easily done on a pattern that you've drafted yourself, that you are using the actual bust point at the top of the dart. When you have a pattern with a dart in it, when you go to sew it, the dart is actually lowered from the bust point roughly about a half of an inch, because you don't want that point right on the apex of the bust. You use it for drafting, but that's not where you actually sew it. So if you've got a purchased pattern and you want to modify the dart and put it in a new location, you need to be aware that the dart that you see on the pattern is probably lower than the bust point. So you would need to extend it to the bust point and then move its location. So you're going to have to play with it a little bit if you're not drafting your own patterns and you're not really sure exactly where that apex point is. I can tell you, if your pattern that you're working with is off the waist, then it's probably around a half of an inch above where they've marked for you to sew the dart. But really, that's all that you need to do to change a dart location on a bodice pattern. And another option that you have, I mean, you can really go crazy with these and modify your patterns to do whatever you want to do. So you can even split a dart. Now I cut all the way through, just to give you an idea. So if you wanted to, you can take one dart, move its location, and then transfer it among, in this case, 3. I've taken one dart, moved it to the shoulder, and made 3 darts into it. So that would make 3 really nice darts coming off the shoulder. Completely change the look of this little top. So that's how you would go ahead and move a dart location on your pattern. There are quite a few different ways that you can form your darts for sewing, and most of the time people will fold them over and try to match up the lines as best they can and then stitch them down. And sometimes if you have transparent fabric like this, you can see through. It's really time consuming, and a lot of times you get crooked lines and crooked darts, and particularly when you're working on a front where you might have 2 darts, it's really important that they look the same. And I found this technique many years ago, and it's the greatest thing I've ever seen, and this is how I always do my darts. So let's start by taking just a little tiny stitch down here at the bottom just to get going, and you can knot the bottom. I'm just going to leave mine loose. And then you draw the thread over like this so that you're creating a ladder effect. Go in the other side, take a pretty generous bite up this leg, come up from the back, and then repeat on the other side. And just work back and forth. You want them fairly straight across, but honestly I've seen them pretty crooked and it still works, so you don't have to be exact about it. Just make sure that you take the needle down on the dart leg and you come up on the dart leg. When you get up to the end, go ahead and come out right at the tip where you want the end of the dart to be. And then when you're finished, grab a hold of the end, both ends and pull. It brings both sides together. If we turn it over, there you can see the dart is perfectly formed. It's right on top of each other. I know exactly where the end is. You probably want to put a couple pins in. It's very quick and easy, and you even have a nice little line that you can follow over at the sewing machine. And this is just a sloper, so I'm not too concerned with the contrast, and that's I've used red here. But don't use this high of a contrast on a real garment. Reason being is when you go over and sew it, you're probably going to hit that thread, and even though you can pull it out in most cases, there's still a chance where some little threads, fuzzies, might be left behind, and you certainly don't want to ruin your stitching line by leaving a high contrast. So just use a thread that's fairly close to your fabric, and you will be able to see it. Even if I'd used white on this, it still would have been very obvious. And of course you can always use the basting thread as well. But this technique is tried and true. I've used it a million times, and I'm sure that you'll find that it helps you to make exact darts very quickly. And the proper way to sew a dart is always to start at the bottom and sew up to the point. And what you'll want to do is use your standard stitch length until you get within about a half of an inch of the dart point. Then reduce the stitch length so the stitches are much smaller and finish off, and then leave tails, so right over the edge, and knot the tails. That's what I've done here. Now I found another interesting technique in my research that I had never seen before, and this book said that you should go ahead and do your standard stitch, and then when you get to within a half inch of the top, you go all the way almost to the very edge of the fold, and then do your last half inch in a smaller stitch right up the edge of the fold, and then go off the end and knot it. So I did these in using both methods on this one little sloper here, and then I pressed them out because I was curious really what the difference was going to be. And so you can decide for yourself just looking at it here. I know it's very subtle, and it's going to depend on where the dart is placed also. These are bust darts, and I have to say that, you know, there's something to be said to this technique. It's a really nice smooth dart, and this one just seems a lot more abrupt. So I'm not going to tell you which one is the right way. I think it's just two different ways, but I would play with it because I think maybe there's something to be said for this method. It's a nice looking finish. Now as far as the dart goes, you're going to have to determine if it needs to be trimmed or not depending on your application. If you are working with a really bulky fabric, this is going to be ridiculous and you aren't going to want this hanging out in the back. In that case, you'll trim it down and finish the edges. Sometimes you want them separate so you can press it open if you have a really heavy fabric, or you can go ahead and finish the edges together. And I can't really tell you which would be best. You're going to just have to look at the fabric that you have and make that determination and how much bulk you've got out here.